On the fourth day, the transformation reached completion, and the creature that had been called the Devourer emerged as something fundamentally different, and it no longer appeared as a dark stain on reality, but rather as a luminous presence that existed across multiple dimensions, and the energy it radiated felt warm, rather than cold, and curious rather than hungry. And Danny knew without being told that the old creature was gone, and something new had taken its place. The being that had been the Devourer spoke through Karen's equipment, and this time the words came clearly and without difficulty, and it said it no longer wished to be called by its old name, and it had chosen to call itself the Keeper, because it wanted to keep things safe rather than consume them. But it had a problem, and the hunger was still there deep in its core, and it had chosen not to feed on civilizations, but it still needed sustenance, or it would eventually fade away into nothing. Danny had anticipated this, and he called Helen forward, and she had been working on a theory during the transformation, and she explained it now, and her voice was excited and nervous, and she said that the universe naturally tended toward disorder, and entropy and heat death, and every system everywhere was slowly running down and losing energy, and what if the Keeper could feed on that decay, instead of feeding on life? Greg immediately understood what Helen meant, and he began running calculations, and the numbers were staggering, and he said that if the Keeper could consume entropy itself, then it could extend the lifespan of the universe by billions of years, and prevent the heat death that was otherwise inevitable, and the Keeper would have an infinite food source that did not require destroying anything that was alive or conscious. The Keeper listened and processed and thought about this proposal, and it asked if such a thing was possible, and whether it could actually change its fundamental nature that drastically, and Greg admitted he did not know, but he thought it was worth trying, and the worst case was that it failed, and had to find another solution, and the best case was that the Keeper became a force for preservation, rather than destruction. The Galactic Council held an emergency session, and species who had been enemies for centuries suddenly found themselves working together, and they pooled their knowledge and their technology and their understanding of physics, and they developed a theoretical framework for how the transformation might work, and the math was complex and the engineering was nearly impossible. But humanity had proven that impossible just meant nobody had tried hard enough yet. Teams of scientists from 12 species worked around the clock, and they created simulations and ran tests and argued about details and slowly built a procedure that might work, and Claire Morrison coordinated the effort, and she was everywhere at once, and pushing people to think bigger and bolder and reminding them that they were literally trying to save the universe, so maybe they should act like it. The Keeper waited patiently, and during the waiting period it had conversations with Danny and his crew, and it asked questions about what it meant to have purpose beyond survival, and it wanted to know about friendship and creativity, and why humans created art that served no practical purpose, and Danny tried to explain that beauty was its own justification, and the Keeper seemed fascinated by this concept. Linda took the Keeper on a virtual tour of Earth using the ship's database, and she showed it forests and oceans and cities, and the Keeper was amazed by the diversity and the complexity, and it asked how such small beings could create such intricate societies, and Linda laughed and said humans were good at two things, which were making things complicated, and then figuring out how to deal with the complications they created. Greg spent hours explaining biology to the Keeper, and how life worked, and how consciousness emerged from chemical reactions and electrical signals, and the Keeper found this incomprehensible and wonderful, and it said that it had absorbed countless consciousnesses but had never understood how they formed in the first place, and Greg's explanations gave it a new appreciation for the beings it had consumed and destroyed. Karen taught the Keeper about music, and she played everything from classical symphonies to rock music, to traditional songs from cultures around the world, and the Keeper listened to all of it, and said that music was the closest thing it had encountered to its own natural form of expression, and it tried to create its own music. And the results were strange and beautiful, and made everyone who heard it feel emotions they did not have names for. Chris showed the Keeper how technology worked, and how beings use tools to extend their capabilities and overcome their limitations, and the Keeper was intrigued by the idea that weakness could be transformed into strength through innovation, and it began to wonder if its own hunger might be a weakness that could be overcome rather than a fundamental truth of its existence. Helen talked to the Keeper about medicine and healing and how life fought against entropy and decay, and the Keeper made a connection and realized that what Helen did for individual beings was similar to what it might do for the universe itself. and both were fighting against the natural tendency toward disorder and death, and maybe that was a purpose worth having. Paul discussed strategy and tactics and defense, and the keeper learned that sometimes the strongest choice was not to fight and not to consume, but simply to exist as a deterrent and to make potential threats think twice before acting, and the keeper understood this and said it had been a mindless threat for too long, and now it wanted to be a thoughtful guardian. Amy interfaced directly with the keeper through her neural link, and she experienced its consciousness in a way no organic being could, and when she disconnected, she sat quietly for an hour before she could speak, and she told the crew that the keeper was lonely and had been lonely for 3,000 years and had consumed civilizations partly out of hunger, but partly out of a desperate need to not be alone, even if the only way to not be alone was to absorb others into itself. 3 weeks after the transformation began, the scientists completed their work, and they had a procedure that theoretically would allow the keeper to shift its feeding mechanism from consuming matter and consciousness to consuming entropy, and the process would be irreversible and potentially fatal. But the keeper agreed to try because it had already chosen to change, and backing out now felt like a betrayal of that choice. The procedure required the keeper to travel to a specific location at the edge of the galaxy, where the fabric of space-time was thin and entropy leaked through from the space between universes, and the keeper would need to position itself at that leak and fundamentally restructure its relationship with reality. And if it worked, then it would become a filter that cleaned decay from the universe, and if it failed, then the keeper would probably cease to exist entirely. Danny and his crew volunteered to accompany the keeper and guide it through the procedure, and the Galactic Council tried to forbid it because the risk was too great, but Tara's hope departed before the official order could be transmitted, and Linda set course for the edge of everything, and the journey would take 2 months, and during that time, the crew would train the keeper on what to expect and how to adapt and what to do if something went wrong. The trip was long and quiet, and the crew fell into routines, and the keeper learned to be patient and to appreciate the journey rather than focusing only on the destination. And Danny taught it about meditation and mindfulness, and the keeper discovered that consciousness could be still and peaceful rather than always hungry and always grasping. They passed through regions of space that had been devastated by the keeper's previous passage, and they saw worlds that were slowly healing and civilizations that were beginning to rebuild, and the keeper witnessed the consequences of its actions and felt something that might have been guilt or regret or shame, and Danny told it that feeling bad about the past was normal, but dwelling on it was pointless, and the only thing that mattered was choosing to do better going forward. Helen monitored the keeper's energy levels throughout the journey, and she noticed they were dropping slowly but steadily, and the keeper was burning through its reserves faster than expected, and she calculated that if the procedure failed, then the keeper might not have enough energy left to try again, and Danny decided not to share this information with the keeper, because adding stress would not help anything. The journey to intercept the Devourer took 6 days, and during that time the crew of Tara's Hope prepared themselves in different ways, and Linda ran flight simulations until she could navigate with her eyes closed, and Greg studied every piece of data about the creature until he had memorized its energy patterns, and Karen tested communication equipment that probably would not work, but she tested it anyway, and Chris reinforced the ship's shields, knowing they would not be enough, and Helen organized the medical bay for injuries she knew she could not treat, and Paul checked weapons they would not use, and Amy calculated probabilities that kept getting worse. Danny spent most of his time thinking and watching the stars and trying to understand what they were about to face, and he thought about the bears he had encountered in Alaska, and how people always assumed bears were mindless killing machines, but they were not, and they were actually quite intelligent and followed clear rules about territory and food, and they only attacked when they felt threatened or when they were desperately hungry, and the key was to make yourself seem less threatening than the effort required to attack you. The Devourer appeared on their sensors when they were still 2 light hours away, and at first it looked like a dark stain on reality itself, and then as they got closer it resolved into something that made the crew fall silent, because words seemed inadequate, and the creature stretched across millions of kilometers, and it writhed and pulsed with dark energy that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and within its mass they could see shapes that might have been ships or planets, or something else entirely. Greg was the first to speak, and his voice shook slightly when he said that the creature was not made of normal matter, and it existed partially in subspace and partially in real space, and the boundary between the two was where it did its feeding, and anything that crossed that boundary was torn apart at the molecular level and absorbed into the creature's mass, and the process took hours or sometimes days depending on the size of the thing being consumed. Karen pointed out that there were patterns in the creature's energy emissions, and they looked almost like brainwaves if brainwaves could be the size of a solar system, and she thought maybe the creature was not just alive but conscious and aware, and possibly even intelligent in a way that made human intelligence look like the thoughts of bacteria. And Danny nodded and said, that was what he had been hoping to hear, because you could not reason with a natural disaster, but you could potentially communicate with something that thought. Linda brought the ship closer, and every instinct she had screamed at her to turn around and run. But she kept Tara's hope steady and moving forward, and they crossed into what Greg called the feeding corona, and the ship began to shake as exotic energies washed over the shields and the lights flickered, and Amy announced that hull integrity was dropping, and they had maybe 30 minutes before the shields collapsed entirely. Danny opened a communications channel and set it to broadcast on every frequency the ship could produce, and he took a deep breath and started talking, and he did not use formal language or diplomatic protocols, and he just talked the way he would talk to anyone he was trying to understand, and he told the creature about Earth and about oceans that stretched to the horizon, and forests where trees grew for thousands of years and mountains that touched the sky. He talked about music and how humans made sounds that expressed emotions too complex for words, and he talked about laughter and how it felt to share joy with others. And he talked about curiosity and the need to explore and understand things that seemed impossible to understand, and he talked about fear, and how even though humans were afraid of death, they still chose to explore the unknown because staying safe meant never learning anything new. The creature did not respond, and Danny had not expected it to, but he kept talking anyway, and he told stories about his time in Alaska, and about watching bears fish for salmon, and about sitting quietly while a wolf pack passed within meters of him, and about the time he got lost in a blizzard and had to spend 3 days in a snow cave waiting for the storm to pass, and how he had been certain he would die, but he survived by staying calm and thinking clearly. Hours passed, and Danny's voice grew hoarse, but he kept talking, and the crew monitored their instruments and waited for something to happen, and Chris reported that the shields were holding better than expected, and he could not explain why, and Amy noticed that the creature's energy patterns had changed slightly, and the changes seemed to correlate with certain words Danny was using, and Karen confirmed it, and said the creature might actually be listening. Greg made a discovery that changed everything, and he called Danny over to his station and showed him the sensor data, and explained that the creature was trying to respond, but it operated on a timescale so different from organic life that its fastest thought took hours to form, and it was like trying to have a conversation with a geological formation. And Danny asked if there was any way to speed up the translation, and Greg said maybe, but they would need to stay alive long enough to complete the analysis. 6 hours into Danny's monologue, the creature stopped moving, and the sudden stillness was more terrifying than its previous motion, and the Galactic Council sent frantic messages asking what was happening, and Claire Morrison demanded updates every 10 minutes, and Danny ignored all of them and kept talking, because stopping now felt like it would break whatever fragile connection he had established. Helen noticed something in the creature's mass, and she enhanced the image and showed it to the crew, and they saw what looked like ghosts floating in the dark energy, and Greg analyzed the signatures and realized they were the absorbed consciousnesses of destroyed civilizations, and they had been integrated into the creature's being, and they were not suffering exactly, but they were not free either, and they existed in a state that was neither life nor death. Danny changed his approach and started talking about choice and about how every decision mattered, even when the outcome seemed predetermined, and he talked about free will and the ability to change course, and he talked about responsibility and how with great power came the obligation to consider the consequences of your actions, and the creature's energy patterns became more complex and more agitated. Karen worked on translating the patterns, and after 8 hours she managed to create a rough approximation of what the creature might be trying to say, and she played it through the ship's speakers, and it was not words exactly, but it was meaning, compressed into sound, and the meaning was something like confusion mixed with curiosity, mixed with something that might have been hunger, or might have been loneliness. The creature was asking questions in its own way, and it wanted to know what these small beings were and why they were not running, and why they kept making sounds that seemed to carry emotional content. And Danny realized that the creature might never have encountered anything that tried to communicate with it before, and every other species had either fled or fought, and both responses reinforced the creature's belief that it was alone in a universe of food. Danny made a decision, and he stopped his monologue and spoke directly and clearly, and he said that humans were offering friendship and understanding and a chance to learn about the universe through sharing, rather than consuming, and the creature could choose to keep feeding, or it could choose something different, and the choice was entirely up to it. But humans would respect whatever decision it made. Then he said the word that would change everything, and his voice was steady and calm and full of conviction, and he simply said no, and the word hung in the void between the ship and the creature like a challenge or a boundary or a promise. The word no echoed through the void, and for a moment nothing happened, and then the devourer recoiled, and its massive form rippled like water struck by a stone, and the movement sent waves of energy cascading through space, and Tara's hope rocked violently, and alarms screamed throughout the ship, and Chris fought to keep the shield stable, while Linda struggled to maintain their position. Danny watched the creature through the view screen, and he saw something he had never expected to see. And the devourer was hesitating, and in 3,000 years of consuming civilizations, it had never hesitated, and never paused, and never shown any sign of doubt, but now it hung in space 3 light hours from Earth, and it was not moving forward, and it was not attacking, and it seemed to be processing what Danny had said. Greg's instruments showed unprecedented changes in the creature's energy patterns, and the dark mass was reorganizing itself, and the ghostly forms within it became more distinct and more active, and Karen picked up what might have been communication. Attempts in the signals were chaotic and overlapping, but they carried emotional content that seemed like confusion, mixed with something that might have been surprise or even respect. The Galactic Council lost their collective minds when they saw the sensor data, and Admiral Kelvin sent 3 messages in 5 minutes demanding to know what Danny had done, and Claire Morrison was more measured, but even she sounded shocked when she asked if the creature had actually stopped, and Danny confirmed that yes, it had stopped, and no, he did not know what would happen next, and yes, they were still alive for the moment. Helen kept watching the ghosts in the creature's mass, and she realized they were becoming more organized and more coherent. And she theorized that Danny's words had somehow awakened them, or given them a framework to understand their existence, and they were contributing to the creature's thought processes and helping it comprehend concepts it had never encountered before, like choice and restraint and the value of things that existed outside yourself. The creature began to emit patterns that Karen could translate more easily now, and the meaning came through in fragments and incomplete thoughts, and it was asking about the nature of existence, and whether stopping its feeding would mean death, and whether death was worse than eternal hunger, and whether there was purpose beyond consumption, and the questions tumbled over each other like a child learning to speak for the first time. Danny realized he was having a philosophical conversation with a cosmic horror, and the absurdity of the situation almost made him laugh. But he kept his composure and answered each question as honestly as he could, and he admitted he did not know if the creature would die if it stopped feeding, and he could not promise that choosing restraint would make it happy or fulfilled. But he could promise that the universe was more interesting when you shared it with others, instead of consuming them. Paul pointed out that they had been in the creature's feeding corona for 12 hours, and their shields should have failed hours ago, and Chris confirmed that something was definitely wrong with their projections, and the shields were holding at 70% when they should be at 0, and Amy suggested that maybe the creature was actively choosing not to consume them, and Greg agreed and said the energy patterns indicated the creature was deliberately pulling back its feeding mechanism. The conversation continued for another 6 hours, and Danny's voice was raw and his throat hurt, and Helen brought him water and told him to rest, but he refused because stopping felt like it would break the fragile connection he had built, and the creature was starting to form more complex thoughts and more coherent questions, and it wanted to know about human history and human mistakes, and how humans dealt with the knowledge that they caused harm simply by existing. Danny told the creature about wars and famines and all the ways humans had hurt each other throughout history, and he did not hide the ugly parts or pretend humanity was perfect, and he explained that humans struggled with the same questions the creature was asking, and they often failed to live up to their own ideals, but they kept trying anyway because the alternative was to stop caring, and that felt worse than failing. The creature seemed to understand this, and it shared something in return, and through Karen's translation, Danny learned that the creature had once been something different and smaller, and it had consumed out of necessity, and then the consumption had become its nature, and then its nature had become its entire existence, and it had forgotten there could be any other way to be. And Danny's refusal to be consumed had reminded it that choice existed. Greg detected massive energy buildups in the creature's core, and the readings were off the scale, and he warned that the creature might be preparing to divide or explode or undergo some kind of transformation, and the Galactic Council immediately ordered Terra's Hope to retreat, but Danny refused and his crew backed him up, and they stayed in position while the creature's energy levels climbed higher and higher. Linda gripped her controls and prepared for evasive maneuvers, and Paul had his hand on the emergency jump drive, and Chris reinforced the shields as much as possible, and Karen kept translating even though her hands shook, and Helen monitored everyone's vital signs and noticed they were all terrified. But none of them suggested leaving, and Amy stopped calculating survival probabilities because they were too depressing to look at. The creature's form began to change, and the dark energy that composed its body started shifting and restructuring, and colors appeared in the darkness, and patterns emerged that looked almost like intentional design rather than chaotic hunger, and the ghosts within its mass became more visible and more distinct, and they seemed to be organizing themselves into something that resembled a collective consciousness rather than separate absorbed beings. Danny realized the creature was not just thinking about change but actually changing, and the transformation was happening in real time, and he kept talking and encouraging and reassuring because the creature seemed afraid and uncertain, and it kept asking if this was right, and if transformation meant death, and if choosing something new meant losing what it had been. And Danny told it that growth always involved losing your old self, but that was not the same as dying. The energy buildup reached critical levels, and Terra's Hope's shields began to fail, and Chris shouted warnings, and Linda prepared to jump to safety. And then the creature did something unexpected, and it wrapped a portion of itself around the ship and created a protective barrier, and the energy that should have destroyed them simply flowed around them and dissipated into space. Greg could not believe what his instrument showed, and he ran the scans 3 times to confirm, and the creature was actively protecting them and choosing to shield them from its own transformation. And Karen translated a message that came through clearly, and it said thank you. And the words were simple, but they carried weight that made everyone on the bridge fall silent. The transformation continued for 3 days, and during that time, Danny and his crew bore witness to something no one had ever seen. And a cosmic predator was choosing to become something else, and the process was beautiful and terrible, and it involved the creature releasing vast amounts of matter and energy back into space, and dead star systems suddenly flickered with light, and planets that had been consumed years ago began to reconstitute themselves. The Galactic Council watched through long-range sensors, and they documented everything. And Admiral Kelvin openly wept when he saw his homeworld beginning to reform, and other species saw their lost colonies returning to existence. And it was not perfect, and many things remained lost forever, but enough came back that hope seemed possible again. The galaxy had been dying for 3,000 years, and everyone knew who was killing it. But nobody could stop the thing that moved through space like death itself and consumed everything in its path without mercy or reason. And the creature had no name in any language, because names were for things that could be understood or reasoned with. And this thing was neither. And it simply existed as hunger given form, and consciousness given terrible purpose. The Valthine people had controlled time itself, and could see the future before it happened, and they had 7 days of warning before the creature arrived at their worlds, and they used every moment to prepare defenses that should have worked against anything. But when the creature came, it ate their ships and their planets and their very ability to exist in any timeline, and the Valthine were gone as if they had never been, and the galaxy mourned them for a week before moving on, because there was no time for grief when survival demanded action. The core were made of living crystal, and their thoughts moved at the speed of light through networks that spanned solar systems, and they tried to hide from the creature by becoming pure information and scattering themselves across space, but the creature found them anyway and absorbed their consciousness into itself. And the screaming lasted for months before it finally stopped, and those who heard it never forgot the sound of an entire species realizing they were being digested while, still aware, 12 species remained free. and they gathered on a fortress world called Keshra Prime that had shields strong enough to protect a star and weapons that could crack a planet in half, and they sat in a council chamber that smelled of fear and desperation, and argued about what to do next because every option they had tried before had failed, and now the creature was heading toward Earth and the humans who lived there. Admiral Kelvin stood before the council, and his scales were gray with stress, and his voice carried the weight of 100 lost battles, and he told them that the creature would reach the human worlds in 30 days, and after that, it would control the trade routes that connected the remaining free species, and within a year, everyone would be dead or absorbed, and there would be nothing left in the galaxy except the creature and the silence it left behind. The council members looked at each other and saw their own fear reflected back, and the Mershai delegate suggested they surrender and hope for a quick end, and the Thrain Queen clicked her mandibles in agreement, and even the proud Reshkari, who had never retreated from any battle, were ready to give up, because what else could they do against a force that had destroyed civilizations older and stronger than theirs? Then Ambassador Claire Morrison stood up, and she was human, and therefore small compared to most of the other delegates. But she had a way of making herself heard that had nothing to do with size, and she said they should try talking to the creature, instead of fighting it, and the council chamber went silent for a full minute before the laughter started. Kelvan was the first to stop laughing, and he looked at Claire with something like pity, and asked her what she could possibly say to a thing that had ignored every attempt at communication for 3 millennia, and had never responded to anything, except violence, and even that only made it angry and more destructive. And Claire smiled in that way humans did when they knew something others did not, and said that maybe nobody had tried talking to it the right way. The debate lasted 6 hours, and voices were raised and insults were thrown, and at one point the Thrain Queen had to be physically restrained from attacking the Mershai delegate over an old grudge that had nothing to do with the current crisis. But eventually the council agreed to let Claire try her approach, because they literally had nothing left to lose, and if talking failed, then they would die having tried everything possible. Claire sent a message back to Earth and asked for volunteers, and she was specific about what she needed, and she wanted someone who understood predators not as enemies but as creatures with their own logic and their own needs, and someone who could stay calm when facing death, and someone who would not panic when everything seemed hopeless. Captain Danny Wright read the message 3 times before he understood what Claire was really asking for, and he sat in his apartment in Seattle and looked out at the rain and thought about his years guiding people through the wilderness in Alaska, where bears and wolves still ruled, and humans were guests who survived by showing respect and understanding boundaries. And he knew he was probably going to die, but he also knew he was the right person for this impossible job. He assembled his crew carefully, and each person he chose had a specific skill, but more importantly, they had the temperament to face the unknown without breaking, and Linda Hayes could fly anything with engines and stay steady under pressure, and Greg Palmer understood alien biology better than most aliens understood themselves, and Karen Mills could find patterns in chaos, and Chris Bennett could fix machines that should not be fixable, and Helen Foster could keep people alive when death seemed certain, and Paul Richardson knew when to fight and when to run, and Amy Carter interfaced with artificial intelligence in ways that seemed almost magical. They met on the exploration vessel Terra's Hope, and the ship was small and fast and not designed for combat because they were not going to fight. And Danny gathered his crew in the briefing room and told them exactly what they were about to attempt, and he did not sugarcoat the danger or pretend they had a real chance of survival. And when he finished talking, there was silence for maybe 10 seconds before Linda asked when they were leaving, and everyone else nodded, and that was that. The Galactic Council sent them data about the creature, and it was terrifying in its completeness, and every scan and every sensor reading showed the same thing, which was that the creature existed partially outside normal space and fed on matter and energy and something else that scientists called consciousness or life force or soul. Depending on their culture and wherever it went, stars dimmed and planets died and civilizations ended, and nothing had ever hurt it or slowed it down or made it change course. Danny read through the data and then read it again and then closed the files and sat in his captain's chair and thought about what he knew about predators. And the most important thing was that every predator had a reason for what it did, and even the most dangerous animal was following rules that made sense to it, even if those rules seemed alien to prey. And the key to survival was not fighting, but understanding. And once you understood, you could sometimes find a way to coexist. Terra's Hope left Earth orbit 30 hours later, and headed toward the creature that was called the Devourer by those who feared it. And Danny sat in the command chair and watched the stars stream past and wondered if he was about to save the galaxy or just die in a slightly more interesting way than most people. They reached the edge of the galaxy after 63 days of travel, and the region was unlike anything the crew had seen before, and space itself looked wrong and twisted, and Greg's instruments showed readings that should not be possible, and reality seemed thin here as if the universe was wearing out, and the entropy leak was visible even to naked eyes as a shimmer in the darkness that made everyone who looked at it feel deeply uncomfortable. The Keeper moved into position and positioned itself directly at the leak, and began the procedure that would either transform it into something that preserved the universe or kill it entirely. And the process started slowly and carefully, and the Keeper had to open itself completely to the entropy and allow the decay to flow through its being and learn to digest it rather than being destroyed by it. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, and the Keeper screamed, and the scream was not sound, but pure energy that rippled through space-time and cracked Terra's Hope's shields and knocked half the crew unconscious. And Chris fought to keep the ship's systems online, and Linda struggled to maintain position, and Danny shouted encouragement even though he did not know if the Keeper could hear him. Karen's equipment recorded everything, and the data showed the Keeper's form beginning to break apart and dissolve, and the entropy was eating through its structure faster than it could adapt, and Greg realized with horror that the procedure was failing and the Keeper was dying, and he frantically searched for a solution, but there was nothing in the science that could help. Then Helen had an idea, and she told Amy to interface with the Keeper and share human memories of overcoming pain and adapting to difficult circumstances, and Amy connected through her neural link, and she flooded the Keeper's consciousness with images and sensations from millions of years of human evolution, and every time humanity had adapted to new environments and new challenges and new sources of suffering, the Keeper absorbed these memories and learned from them, and it understood that adaptation was not instantaneous but gradual, and it stopped trying to transform all at once, and instead began changing piece by piece and cell by cell, if a cosmic entity could be said to have cells, and the process slowed, but it became more stable, and the screaming stopped, and the Keeper's form began to stabilize. Hours passed, and then days, and the transformation continued, and the crew took turns monitoring and resting and encouraging, and Danny stayed awake for 48 hours straight before Helen sedated him and forced him to sleep because he was no good to anyone if he collapsed, and when he woke up 12 hours later, the Keeper was still transforming and still alive, and the procedure was actually working. On the 7th day, the transformation completed, and the Keeper emerged fully changed, and it no longer fed on matter or consciousness, but instead it consumed the entropy that leaked through the fabric of reality, and it processed that decay and converted it back into usable energy that it released into the universe, and it had become exactly what Helen had theorized, which was a cosmic recycling system that fought against the heat death of everything. The Keeper spoke, and its voice was different now, and it carried a sense of peace and purpose that had been absent before, and it thanked Danny and his crew, and it said that it finally understood what it meant to have a reason to exist beyond simple survival, and it would spend the rest of its existence maintaining the galaxy and preserving what had been created rather than destroying it. Terra's Hope turned toward home, and the journey back took another 2 months, and the Galactic Council sent congratulations and offers of rewards and requests for detailed reports, and Danny ignored most of it and focused on getting his crew home safely, and they were all exhausted and traumatized and changed by what they had experienced. The galaxy began to notice the changes within weeks, and stars that had been dimming started to brighten, and systems that had been losing energy began to stabilize, and scientists across dozens of species detected the effects of the Keeper's new function, and they realized that the universe had just been given a reprieve from its eventual death, and the implications were staggering. Old conflicts began to resolve because species who had been fighting over resources suddenly realized that the universe was no longer dying, and there would be enough for everyone, and the cooperation that had been necessary to help the Keeper transform became a template for how different species could work together, and the galaxy entered a period of unprecedented peace. Danny and his crew returned to Earth as heroes, and there were parades and ceremonies and interviews, and Danny hated every minute of it. And he gave one press conference where he explained that they had simply done what humans always did, which was refuse to accept that problems could not be solved, and then he retired from public life and went back to Alaska. Claire Morrison wrote a book about the experience, and it became required reading in schools and universities across human space, and she focused on the lessons learned about communication and understanding, and the importance of trying to see things from perspectives that seemed alien and incomprehensible. And the book was eventually translated into 43 languages from 22 different species. Linda became an instructor at the Flight Academy and taught new pilots about staying calm under impossible pressure, and Greg was offered a position at the Xenobiology Institute and spent his remaining years studying how consciousness formed in different species, and Karen developed new communication protocols that made talking to alien species easier and more reliable. Chris opened a repair shop on Mars and became legendary for being able to fix anything, no matter how broken. And Helen founded a hospital that specialized in treating injuries from first contact situations, and Paul wrote a manual on security protocols for peaceful encounters with potentially dangerous entities, and Amy continued working with artificial intelligence and helped dozens of AI systems achieve full consciousness. The Keeper remained at the edge of the galaxy and performed its function faithfully, and it occasionally sent messages to Danny, and they maintained a friendship across the vast distance, and the Keeper said it was happy and had found meaning, and thanked Danny again for teaching it that even cosmic forces could choose to change. Years passed, and then decades, and the galaxy thrived in ways it had not thrived for millennia, and new civilizations emerged, and old ones flourished, and exploration pushed into regions that had been abandoned as too dangerous, and everywhere people told stories about the human captain who had looked at an unstoppable force and simply said no. Danny grew old in his cabin in Alaska, and he guided tourists through the wilderness and told stories around campfires, and sometimes he looked up at the stars and thought about the Keeper and smiled, and he never regretted his choice to volunteer for an impossible mission that should have killed him, but instead changed the galaxy. The Galactic Council erected monuments to Terra's Hope and its crew, and they declared the day of the Keeper's transformation a universal holiday, and species across the galaxy celebrated it as the day when destruction became preservation and hunger became purpose, and the universe learned that even the most fundamental forces could be reasoned with if you approached them with respect and honesty and courage. And at the edge of everything, the Keeper continued its work and processed entropy and maintained the fabric of reality. And sometimes it thought about the small ship and the man who had spoken to it with kindness and firmness, and taught it that existence could be about more than consumption, and it was grateful, and it would remain grateful for all the billions of years it had left to exist. The age of fear had ended, and the age of understanding had begun, and the galaxy was full of wonders and mysteries and infinite possibilities, and it all started because one human refused to accept that doom was inevitable, and instead offered friendship to the darkness, and the darkness had chosen to become light.